Hello, I'm Professor Donna Byrne, and this is the Estates and Trusts online module on intestacy. This is the first part of the intestacy unit, and you should have already read pages 37 through 52 in Andersen and Bloom, and I know you already read Skills and Values Chapter 1 because we did that last week. We will be doing Task 2, but you should wait until we've worked through those materials in class. Okay, after this module, you should be able to use terminology related to the intestate estate. You should be able to explain the role of intestacy statutes in estate administration. You'll be able to identify the intestate estate. You'll be able to find the appropriate intestacy statute, and you'll be able to use the statute to determine how long an heir must survive in order to take. Okay, so first of all, a little bit of terminology, because sometimes it's intimidating to use these words at first, but you'll get comfortable with them if you're not already. If somebody dies testate, that means they died with a will. Remember, the word testament meant will. Testate means with a will. Intestate means without a will. Looks like interstate, but without the R. Okay, so intestate can also be an adjective, and in particular we see it a lot with intestate estate, and that means the part of the probate estate that doesn't get disposed of by a will. So either because there is no will, or because there's a will that doesn't quite dispose of everything. So we could have a will that either wasn't complete, or that part of it was invalid, and so therefore we end up with part of the estate that gets transferred by intestacy anyway. Okay, so remember, probate estate, that was the property that's in the decedent's name, and the decedent is someone who's deceased. Okay, heirs are the people who take under an intestacy statute. And so if the person left a will, if the decedent died testate, then the heirs may not be the ones who are receiving the estate. Okay, so when we say heirs, usually we mean the people who are specified under the intestate estate. Okay, here we go. This is an important one. Descendants. Descendants. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. We need the word children in the relationship. So think about all your relatives. Think about which ones are descendants and which ones are not. And here's a clue. If you have never had children, you do not have any descendants. So lots of people are not descendants, even though they may be close relatives. Siblings, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles, cousins, parents and grandparents, those are last two are ancestors. These people may be your heirs, but they're not descendants. Okay, issue. We see the word issue. Issue is the same as descendants. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. If you drew a family tree, they're the ones that go straight down from you. Here's a fun, stupid challenge. To practice pronouncing decedent and descendant. You can read this out loud. The decedent left a will which was defective, but would have left nothing for the descendants. Descendants sued the decedent's estate, insisting that a defect in the will left the decedent intestate, and that the entire estate should go to the decedent's descendants. Now you, go for it. Okay, talking about the intestacy statutes, the intestacy system. This is kind of a universal estate plan. This is what you get if you didn't get around to making an estate plan. So think about what you would want the government-provided estate plan to do for all those people who don't get around to doing it themselves. Who would be first in line? Who would be second? How would we determine who those people are? And then how do we identify them? So if we're talking about spouse, who's a spouse? If we're talking about child, who is a child? Okay, so we're trying to come up with a scheme that would pretty much respect most people's expectations. And so if you think about your family, who would you expect would inherit your estate? Who would you expect would inherit your grandparents' estate? Right? Who would be next if your first choice didn't survive? All right, we're hoping to have a statute that answers that question the right way for most people. On the other hand, are there people out there that maybe shouldn't inherit? And how specific can we get? Okay, I keep saying okay. I got to stop that. Survivors. When we're talking about who's left, who's first in line, who's second line, it may be obvious, it should be obvious, that we're talking about people who survive the decedent. Now on the TV show, surviving means you got money, all right? I don't watch this show, but I did one time. In intestacy, surviving may also mean that then you're in line to get money. So this really matters. Deciding who's a survivor is kind of important. One question, how long do you have to survive in order to count as a surviving heir? We're going to talk about Grandpa Bob from time to time. I like to make an example of him because he made my life miserable. Love him to pieces. It did. Grandpa Bob was about 80 and had a brand new wife who was somewhat younger. And so they executed new wills. And his will said, if I die, everything goes to Kathy. Kathy's will said, if I die, everything goes to Bob. Kathy didn't have anything, so big deal. But Bob said, if I die, everything goes to Kathy. Clear enough. But what if Bob and Kathy were in a car accident and Bob died and then Kathy died the next day? Would you still want Kathy to inherit? Now this is a will, but we have the same question for the intestacy statute. What if there was no will, but Bob and Kathy were in a car accident and they died within a day of each other? Should there be a minimum survival requirement in our statute? And if so, how long should it be? Is a day enough? Let's take a look at Uniform Probate Code section 2-104. I think it's on page 39 in your casebook, but it's also on the next slide. And this is the Minnesota version. So it's 524.2-104. 524, chapter 524 is the Minnesota Probate Code. So if you need to find any of these online, that's where you might want to go. If you can't remember that, just Google Minnesota Probate Code. And here is the statute, a requirement that an heir survive the decedent for 120 hours. I'm just going to read the first sentence, and I just want to make a point that the title is not the statute. The text is the statute. The title is just a title. So here's the rule. An individual who fails to survive the decedent by 120 hours is deemed to have predeceased the decedent for purposes of homestead, exempt property, and intestate succession, and the decedent's heirs are determined accordingly. Okay, and then there's a couple other parts. We'll look at these. We'll unpack all of this. So if Kathy did not survive for 120 hours, that's 5 days, what is the legal result? Right, and here it is. If she didn't survive for 120 hours, she is deemed to have predeceased the decedent for purposes of homestead, exempt property, and intestate succession. And the decedent's heirs are determined accordingly. In other words, we pretend that Kathy died first, and then we figure out who Bob's intestate heirs are. Okay, there's more. What if for some reason we can't tell whether Kathy survived for 120 hours? That's 5 days. You can imagine some scenarios where people are lost in the wilderness and we don't find their bodies soon enough to really tell what order they went or how long one of them survived the other. Do we assume in that case, let's say we can tell that Kathy survived Bob, but we can't tell for how long. Do we assume that she survived for long enough or that she didn't survive for long enough? Okay, well, here's the statute. If it is not established that an individual who would otherwise be an heir survived the decedent by 120 hours, it is deemed that the individual failed to survive for the required period. Right. So that creates for us a presumption It says if you can't show it, then we presume that there was no survival. And we pretend that Kathy predeceased Bob. Right? It's a default rule. We need that. We need to have the switch starting out in one place or the other. So that means that we have to show survivorship. We will keep an eye out for these default rules as we read the statute, but that's something that you should have on your statute reading radar. What's the default rule? What's the presumption? Okay, so we've got that. We know that if Kathy survives for 120 hours, we're fine, but if she didn't, or if we can't show that she did, then we look around and see who else there is. What if Bob had no other relatives? None. If that were the case, this rule would really suck, because it would mean not only, did Bob's relatives not get anything because he didn't have any, Kathy's relatives don't get it either. So in general, what happens when there's no relatives, no heirs, is the state, the government, gets all of it. So, think Minnesota Department of Revenue. That's who we're talking about. It escheats. The word is escheat. Most people don't want that. So if we're trying to have an intestacy statute that does what most people would want anyway, this could be a sucky rule that says, okay, she didn't survive long enough, therefore the state gets it instead of her family. Most people don't want that. So here's the third part of that statute. The section's not to be applied if its application would result in the taking of an intestate estate by the state under section 2-105. Okay, so that's a relief. This rule won't kick in if it means that the state gets it instead of the non-survivor's estate instead. Does that make sense? Okay. So what's your opinion? Is 120 hours enough? 5 days? That's 5 days. So if you think about Grandpa Bob, whose will said everything to Kathy, if he had the 120-hour survivorship rule in his will, and she died 1 week later, what happens to his estate? If that happened, it would all go to her estate, and it would go on to her heirs. So is a week long enough? Is 5 days long enough? Where would you cut this off? Next question, and this is what we'll be exploring in class. Who should be first in line? If there's no will to tell us who gets the estate, who should it go to? If that person's not around, who would be next? Okay, and are there any exceptions to that? And you can think about your own family, you can think about your own situation, or people who are close to you if you've got somebody who's involved in estate planning right now. So go to the discussion board and post your thoughts on this. Who should be first in line? And is 120 hours enough, or is it too much, or whatever? Okay, see you next time. Thanks for watching. Oh, no, not done yet. Sorry, summary. So descendants, we talked about who are your descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. We looked at some other terminology, testate, intestate. We saw that intestacy is a one-size-fits-all estate plan, and we're going to explore that concept a little more. That the intestate estate could be any part of the probate estate that doesn't get disposed of by a will. So we can still have an intestate estate even if we have a will that takes care of some of the property. We talked about the survivorship rule, saw that the Uniform Probate Code requires 120 hours, and that it creates a presumption of non-survival, so we have to show that the heir did survive. Okay, I'll see you in class for the rest of this. Thank you for watching.